Hello, Brian. Oh, Hisashi Birdie. It is good to be back with you here on Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
Hello, I'm Ollie Horn. Look, it's us again on your podcast player. Who would have thought it? It was even odds whether we would.
But we did. And we are bringing back guests. Joining us this episode is Oleg Benesch, Japanese historian and castle fanatic, and he's also very well known for his advocacy work towards the preservation of castle moats. Oleg, that's work that Ollie and I would love to get behind, but to be honest, in this day and age, I can't really think of a single thing that a moat would be good for. Can you?
Got him. We are going to be hearing from Oleg later in the show, but before we do so, Bobby, let's you and I go into our private booth. We haven't got to come up with a good boating terminology for this yet, but our under the boat cabin,
our dinghy. We're gonna we'll we're gonna take a little excursion on the dinghy, and we'll be back with you, Oleg, in just a little bit.
So, Bobby, let's unchain our favorite swan boat from the dock and have a little chat about what we're going to talk about in the show. So, Bobby, what's coming up on the show?
Well, this time around, we will be dipping our toes into the cold, unforgiving current of our new monthly format. So we're going to do our best to do one of those eps where we don't talk about the latest ultra-depressing apocalyptic event. To wit, we'll be talking about some of Japan's most famous castles, and not just the main one, Disney's. Plus, later in the show, Ollie will be giving his river cruise recommendation. Isn't that right, Ollie?
Well, Bobby, given that we took an unexpected hiatus, a number of river cruises that we promised to do paid promotion for have asked for refunds of their sponsorship deals. So I'd like to take the time in this episode to mourn the loss of the Nara City Boat Tour, who were counting on us to shift tickets for their February the 1st launch. Instead, they sold just 3 tickets, and so turned their cruise into an Edinburgh Fringe venue instead.
Oh, so that's actually a pretty successful number of tickets sold.
It is. And I'd also like to say sorry to the Horsagawa UK-Japan Friendship River Cruise, who pulled their sponsorship on the show when I explained to them during what were quite friendly negotiations they should probably dial back the Queen Elizabeth II branding, given that 2022 is the year that she will pass, kickstarting the UK into its inevitable and desirable transition into a republic.
And we should point out that you said that in response to them asking whether or not you liked British ale.
Yeah, and I don't. There's a reason why we've invented new drinks since. And finally, I need to apologise to Apple, who paid us a considerable amount of money to advertise their Apple special event River Cruise in Tokyo. I can't believe I managed to keep the contents of the NDA secret for all this time.
Yeah, you were aware of their top secret iPhone launch details the entire time?
Yeah, honestly, I couldn't sleep knowing that they'd revolutionised the iPhone by making a green one. I was one of the handful of people in the world who was privy to this super secret, very important info.
Sounds like a real nightmare. And speaking of nightmares, while we were away, my Japanese River Cruise news desk got stacked so full of incoming industry news items that it actually sank the boat we were using as our office. So that's the reason I won't be doing a full rundown later in the show. Also, sincere apologies to the families of the secretarial staff we were employing. That's on us.
Good. And on that note, Bobby, let's jump into this new style, Soap Talk.
We've managed to convince Brian to come back and join us again in the studio on the condition that he gets a full on-air apology for abandoning him for all of these weeks. Brian, we are sincerely sorry, and if you can find it in your heart to forgive us, just maintain your silence.
Thank you. Right, Bobby, we've got loads to catch up on. The first thing, you called me out for what you described as a problematic joke. Here we go. Let's open this can of worms.
I didn't say it was a problematic joke. I said it was a really bad note to leave off on, considering what happened after.
Yeah, exactly. So the last show that we managed to get out, which was some point in end of January, right? I made the River Cruise recommendation I made was a Russian themed one where I made the joke Crimea River, which is
it was a Trojan horse joke. It was the premise was that Russia was launching a cruise into the Ukraine, and it was on the premise of a cruise, and that it was going to be invading.
And exactly. And the reason that it was I thought was a good bit of parody was, right, Russia at that point had put tanks on the border of Ukraine, and everyone, all sensible people going, yeah, but they're not actually going to invade Ukraine, are they? And so I thought that was a good River Cruise parody. A little bit behind the curtain there. Not all the River Cruise recommendations are real. I thought that was funny because it was pointing out the absurdity of like the fact that we're not talking about the fact that Russia's obviously about to invade Ukraine, but we'd all persuaded ourselves that they hadn't. And now Russia has invaded Ukraine. We're like, well, who could have seen that coming? Well, obviously all the people that ignored the fact that Russia was literally putting tanks on the Ukrainian border. And crucially, Putin was basically saying, I plan to invade Ukraine.
Well, yeah, I don't know if this is a hindsight thing, like what the current events are coloring the way I remember it, but I don't think I remember everybody in the world going, oh, they're never going to invade. I feel like it was a real concern.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was a concern. But it was a concern that was discounted in the same way that right now everyone's discounting the threat of nuclear weapons. What a nasty way to
God.
Again.
So like
we wanted to keep this positive, I know, but
yeah,
Jesus.
like we discussed this between us, like, and we got messages kind of saying like we enjoy the parts where you keep it, a little bit less political. We enjoy kind of the banter. We enjoy some of the fun stuff. And there was so much, we were doing so much current events and news, and all of the news was COVID, anti-government, the Olympics are terrible, the world is terrible. And like, we wanted to kind of step back into doing this with just a light show. And the day that we said our recording, like 2 hours ago, the Democratic Republic of Korea just launched the what was it, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, launched their 12th missile launch this year.
Yeah. Well, I guess that is kind of what flavored the show, that we would basically be doom scrolling Twitter. And when you have a podcast such as ours, you can take your doom scrolling to the next level by feeling really despondent and really sad and thinking, I can do nothing about the state of the world. And then using our JBRC Pod Twitter account, reach out to a world-leading expert to verify that we are right to be this anxious and this concerned about the state of the world. And so that's kind of the cycle that we got ourselves into. Every week, we just invite a new expert, journalist or academic or celebrity to affirm that in their niche, we are right to be scared.
And, I feel like we did focus so much on current events that we got distracted from kind of the personal aspect of it. We used to do a lot more, Soap Talk was just kind of like a catching up. How's your comedy shows doing? How is your life in Japan going? And I think we just started getting a caliber of guests who were so interesting that we felt like if we didn't focus on everything that they had to share, that it was kind of mottainai. It was kind of a waste of having them on.
Yeah, and that kind of mottainai feeling is something that quite a few comics, certainly in Europe, have been talking about. That when faced with like an actual war in Europe that's actually currently happening, and when faced with the fact that like COVID's still a thing and people are still dying, and when faced with the fact that there's still really scary right-wing movements all around the world, and like all the things that we should be worried about, lest we forget climate change, lest we forget the fact that we can't afford to put petrol in our cars, right? All the stuff which makes us feel like, what's the point? There's an interesting chat that's happening in comedy green rooms at the moment, which is our job as comedians, and I guess more broadly podcasters, is it less important or more important? Are we supposed to go, well, obviously we should stop worrying about, the sound quality and which jingle we should use, and just go and pick up a rifle and head to the Ukrainian border, or actually, I don't know, were comedians important during World War II? I guess they were, like musicians were. I don't know. It's a funny thing, because I've had thoughts where I'm like, well, I should just quit everything. And for those of you that know me personally, and those that listen to that very brief little snippet I did the other week, know that my personal life hasn't been double thumbs up. Let's put it that way. And so comedy is kind of has been seen as a bit of an indulgence, I guess, from my perspective. Same with the podcast. It's like, well, is this something that we do as an indulgence for fun? But then, of course, and without wanting to sound all bloody holy and preachy, we do get the odd message from people who say that they really enjoyed the show. Or I had someone come up to me after a show 2 weeks ago saying it was a regional show in the UK. So it was one of these comedy clubs that happens like once every 6 months in the village hall, you know, and like the clowns just turn up in a car and it's like everyone from the village is there. And there was a lady who was almost in tears. She was like, I've been an NHS nurse. It's been the hardest 2 years of my life. You know, I've lost family members. This was the first time I've gone out and I really needed this. And little moments like that made me think, okay, maybe, just maybe, like there's a, you know, I can justify what I'm doing more broadly than this is an act of self-indulgence.
I think that's true, and I think it's also okay that it's self-indulgent. You go, everything's shit, so I should just quit. You know, there's climate change, there's corona, there's all of this stuff is going wrong. There's, you know, the world on the brink of World War III. I should just quit. Yeah, but like, then what do? Well, you got to do something to pass the time until we all die. Like, what's the point? It's okay that it's self-indulgent. I mean, you've got to do something to enjoy yourself. You still got a life you got to get through.
Yeah, and hopefully with this new monthly cadence for the show, we're gonna allow ourselves a little bit more space to.
Well, let's just talk. I mean, how's life? All kinds of stuff is going on over here, man.
Right. So. Let's catch up then. So
my girls graduated preschool.
Yeah, so that's the first thing. So you were like, "Oh, I can't have a chat about the show yesterday. My girls have graduated preschool." I remember when these little children were born. How dare they graduate preschool?
They're 6. They're starting elementary school next month. It's insane. They can read. They can read Japanese and English. Ami read Green Eggs and Ham all by herself the other day.
Actual humans. It's weird, isn't it?
It's nuts.
And how does it feel that they're starting an actual school?
Good. Really, really good. I'm looking forward to it. The graduation is interesting. A preschool graduation. We went to the service. They didn't die. They graduated. We went to the ceremony today. And they said, you know, the preschool kids are all going to march out now. Welcome them with a round of applause. And the kids marched out, and there was no applause. No one was clapping. I did that very Japanese thing where you start to clap, and then you realize no one else is clapping, so you stop immediately. And I looked around, and the reason no one was clapping was because everybody was filming it with their phones.
Oh, of course.
And I talked about it with my wife afterwards, and I was like, it's just so weird to me that like there's no clapping and there's nobody watching it with their eyes because everyone's looking through their phones, everyone's touching their phones. And she was like, yeah, well, you're touching your phone too. And I was like, yeah, but I'm not filming, I'm playing Candy Crush.
That's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, what's the point in documenting a moment if you weren't there in the first place?
Yeah. And also nobody ever watches it later. You're not gonna. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I thought, I had exactly that thought. I was walking around a market yesterday in Barcelona, which is where I am. Little name drop there. That's where I am. And
don't do it like that. Do it like you did when we first got on the call. If you're gonna name drop it.
How did I do it? How did I do it that way?
You said, I've just got my setup here in Barcelona. Like.
BCN. But going back to you, so in addition to your kids graduating preschool, you've also moved house?
Yeah. We are officially moved in and settled in Karatsu now.
Where's Karatsu, for those that don't know?
Karatsu is in Saga on the border of Fukuoka. So it's actually not that far from where we used to live in Itoshima. In fact, for the last month, we've been living here, but they've been commuting to preschool in Itoshima just so they could kind of graduate with their friends.
Right. And it's quite easy to get to, isn't it? Because I remember doing quite a bit of work for Saga TV getting to Karatsu.
Yeah.
And taking the main, like, subway line. Like, that train just, some of the services just continue all the way to Karatsu.
Well, Karatsu is big, so it's big, and we live on the side that's the closest to Fukuoka, and we live up in the mountains, but like you can get directly off the highway and just like take a little road 5-10 minutes up into the mountains, and we're right there. And so my commutes to work are actually one of them is shorter because I'm closer to like the bypasses and the highways, and the other one is just shorter because we're geographically closer to the main building in Saga City. So I've moved farther away, and my commutes have gotten shorter.
So in theory, can you get on the Kukosen, the airport line, the one which goes through Meinohama, straight from your local station?
Well, I've been driving everywhere.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah, no, we'd be a little bit of a bus ride from the closest train station. But the
Right. Okay.
house is really big and really nice, and we fixed it up. It's one of the kinds of things that you could only do because it's out in the countryside. It's huge. There's so much space, and we've just had the extra money because it was cheaper because it's in the countryside to put in the renovations, and it's fabulous. It's really, really
Mm.
nice. And Ami and Louis, like for the first time, have kind of like noticed that the space and the design of the place that we live is different from the people around us, and have started to wonder whether or not we're rich. And they asked the other day if we were rich because our house was so big. And I had to be like, well, if we had the house and still had money, we'd be rich. But we're like,
Right.
But that's not how it worked out. And
You're about to start real school, so let me talk to you about
Yeah.
the concept of assets and
Yeah.
depreciation. Let's go.
it's like we are not okane mochi, we are okane mota. It's past tense. It's like we had the money, now we don't. We have a house, but we no
Yeah.
longer have the money.
But the house which you lived in, which I visited fairly often, and I think I stayed over a couple of times, it
Yeah.
wasn't big enough to raise a family with two growing daughters, was it? It was good for a couple of babies, but now these are like real people.
So I mean, it depends on what your standards are. I think our old house, by Japanese standards, was also really big.
Was
I mean,
it?
it was a 5 bedroom.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We never let you into the upstairs.
You told me those child gates were for Amy and Louis.
But just for context, the old house was a 5 bedroom, and this house is an 11 bedroom.
Okay, how many more kids are you planning to have?
None, none. But we're turning half of it into an Airbnb and barbecue place. So
Yeah.
so we're only using half of the 11 bedroom for our family, and then the rest we're going to kind of turn into a business.
Very nice. Well, I'm sure lots of Japan by River Cruise listeners will eventually make their way there.
It's the Tamashima Gawa is the river that we are directly on.
Okay, and the obvious question is, are there cruises yet?
We'll set a couple planks out. You can float on the planks.
It's good enough for me. Good. All right. Well, that's that caught up with. What else? What other big stuff has happened? In the UK, we got rid of COVID, so that's good. That's no longer a thing.
Oh, cool.
Completed that.
How'd you do that?
Just wish it away. And Japan still hasn't opened its borders.
It kind of has. It kind of has. People are coming in again. Students are getting their visas approved. Our friend JJ, who was one of our first guests, JJ Wakrat, a comedian in Tokyo,
Yeah.
moved to Canada, and he's coming back to visit in just a couple weeks. And I guess
On what basis? He's not a tourist.
So he still has residency status, but now
Right.
you don't even have to quarantine if you have all 3 vaccinations, if you're vaxxed and boosted, and if you test negative once you get into the country. You don't even have to quarantine.
That's very good news. Well, I don't. I think I have told you this, but I might as well just make it public. I've speculatively bought a flight for January next year
Yeah.
because I'm taking a bet that by that point tourists will be allowed in. So if there's gonna be a Japan by River Cruise live recording and or boat trip and or me eating all of your barbecue, it's gonna happen during the last 2 weeks of January next year. So hopefully by then, borders will have fully opened up. That's the hope,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah. My mom was planning to come over with some family. Last year was the year that she was going to make her 3rd trip over. First since Ami and Louis were born, but that didn't happen. And then she was going to do it
Yeah,
this
of
year, and
course.
that's not going to happen. So
But
hopefully,
presumably, as the grandparent of Japanese children, there's no special visa rights,
no,
is
no,
there?
no.
She has to
no.
come in as a
If it was,
tourist. No.
if it was a mother or father, then you could probably work out some emergency. But
Yeah.
grandparents now.
Okay, good. Well, I think that's. I mean, there's loads of other stuff we could have caught up on, but we can save that to the next episode. I think that's the main stuff. Other
Yeah.
than that, we're both ticking along. We're more or less there. I may next month be chiming in from a different location yet again.
Fingers
I've kind
crossed.
of accidentally become nomadic. Yeah, fingers
Are
crossed.
you getting any closer to getting your own place?
Yes and no. Very, very long story short, I've been trying really, really hard to get my own place for a very long time. It's not very affordable, and the circumstances that I have are that, for the longest time, a lot of my net worth was just tied up in like foreign cash that I just got from gigs. So like persuading a mortgage lender that I am not going to be one of the main vectors of the next international credit crisis has been a challenge, and there's been just various other problems and what have you, but I'm trying really, really hard, and so hopefully if it's going to happen at all, it's going to happen next month, and if it doesn't happen, then fuck it, I'll be fine. But anyway, look, we're ticking along. I'm still gigging as often as I can, and if there's anyone in Europe that is hoping to watch me do some comedy, then I do update my Instagram Ollie Horn pics with where I'm going to be. So there's that, and if you're a fan of the show, let me know before you come to a show, and I'll make sure to bring some stickers along. So, in fact, on the note of stickers and merch and coffees and whatever else, thanks everyone that kept up their monthly subscription, even while we took a month, which has now become 2 months off. We appreciate it. If you want your money back, you obviously can.
Yeah. I just want to make that real clear. If anybody wants to ask for a refund based on the fact that you bought a monthly subscription or you expected weekly shows or weekly extras, then please feel free to ask. We'll make it right.
Yeah, and all we'll do is we'll come up with a section in next week's show where we say your name, and we absolutely
no. We're not going to treat you like a pachinko parlor that's not following the government COVID regulations. No, but we do sincerely appreciate all of the messages that people have sent. We got messages of encouragement from Anna, from B. Ryan, from Brian, from the guys at Sakamichi Brewing, from the guys at Ishikawa Summit to Sea, from Romeo Marcantuoni, who's we'd love to have on as a guest sometime, from Jason Mischel, from Smith and Tanaka, from many, many more people.
Yeah, I got a handful of DMs as well, which I need to say thanks to those people of sending encouragement. It seems that like this was part of people's like weekly schedule to listen to our nonsense, and it was missed. So which is very nice to know.
And Ollie, you sent me a review that I liked from Nick Chill 19, who said, "I love this podcast and I've been binging it. These guys are actually really funny, especially Ollie. So I wish they'd banter a bit more like the early episodes and maybe a little less politics / social justice. But I know Bobby is passionate about that stuff." I like that he identified you as funny, and I like that he identified me as the person who cares about, as he puts it, stuff.
I know. If we had to distill every bit of feedback that we've ever got about this show, I think Nick Chill has got it pretty good. Literally no one has ever sent us a message saying, "I love this podcast," full stop, and that's it. There has to be some kind of caveat or feedback or room for improvement. And additionally, like I think he's right, but he's only like 60-70% right. It's like these guys are actually really funny. No, we are. Especially Oni, I don't think it's true. I think actually Bobby is a better joke writer than I am. I think I just care less and I take greater risks. I wish they'd banter a bit more. How can we banter when we're both feeling sad? But we're feeling a bit better now, so certainly I am. And so maybe we can banter a bit more, and we have more time for it now because these episodes are an hour long. A little bit less politics, social justice. Well, as we've mentioned, how can we not? Everything's political.
But
thank you.
We'll do our best.
Right. In our new section, Bobby, let's find out. Oh, no, we already know. In that case, let's reaffirm who we've invited to the Captain's Table. Ahoy!
Joining us this time at the Captain's Table is Oleg Benesch. We asked you here so we could talk about something educational, but not necessarily current or political. And in your email correspondence, your response was, "Castles are always current and political." So someone did not understand the assignment.
No, I'm notorious for not understanding assignments.
So, but that's a curious point. Why are Japanese castles political?
Well, there's a few different reasons, and I mean, I guess that's one of the things. If they've been political probably since their very beginnings, I guess, if we want to call it that, in the 16th century in terms of why they're built. But what I tend to focus on more is their modern history. I mean, what happens to castles, after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. As most people who've been to Japan will know, Japan is covered with mainly concrete castles, quite a few old wooden ones left over. And there are a lot of attempts to rebuild castles at the moment. I mean, Nagoya is the most famous example of that. And they've earmarked something like 50 billion yen to tear down their concrete castle and rebuild it out of wood. And this is a really big political debate in Nagoya and Japan more broadly at the moment.
So who generally built castles in the first place? Because not all castles were military, right?
So if we go back far enough, I think they all had military functions. If we're looking back in the 16th century. Then after Japan gets unified around 1600, the country is pacified, essentially. There's no major wars for about 250 years throughout most of the Tokugawa period, and they really are just kind of symbols of authority. Militarily, they're largely obsolete, and, it's warlords building them as these symbols of authority to kind of awe the local peasantry and such, which in a lot of ways isn't actually that different from Europe or the rest of the world where we have these sort of fortifications.
Well, I guess that was kind of what I was thinking, that when I think about kind of castles in the UK, obviously we've got like the really, really, really old castles that were used for military. But when I think about the quote unquote castles from the last 400-500 years, they're kind of like palaces, right? Like they're built by rich people or the royal family to say, look who's in charge. And I think that's true for like most of Western Europe as well. And I'm guessing something similar is true in Japan, that where a castle's not useful because no longer is war done with archers, it's like there's got to be some like greater reason why castles were built, and presumably that reason is the same reason that we want to preserve them too.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, a big part of it is very similar to Europe in a lot of ways. And if we look at early modern Japan, so around 1600 to late 19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled the whole country, they were kind of holding together all these smaller domains. There's over 250 of them and all these smaller warlords. And so that they don't get too strong, one thing that Tokugawa did is they would limit them to one castle each, and they were not allowed to modify that castle without permission. They couldn't become too big, they couldn't become a threat to the Tokugawa, but they also had to maintain them at a certain level. Because the Tokugawa wanted them to spend money on these things to also keep them weak and a bit poorer.
I do remember when I was reading Amy Stanley's book, Stranger in the Shogun City, she referred to this idea that basically all of the aristocracy and all of the kind of like political figureheads were in debt. They were all poor. And it was this system that was based on lending out money or borrowing money where you could buy these fancy houses and live this fancy lifestyle, but it was all very closely tied to whether or not your political currency was working or not, and it could be shut off at any time.
Yeah, no, A.B. Stanley's book is excellent. I definitely recommend that one. And that's the thing, throughout the whole system, debt is such an important part of it all the way through. And you have this kind of fiction that you have, like, the warriors, kind of the samurai class at the top with, the shogun at the very top. And then the merchants supposedly are at the bottom of this order. But actually, if you look at financially, the merchants are often far more better off than many of the samurai. And a lot of the samurai are unemployed, just scraping by. The whole system is not that healthy in a lot of ways. And it's interesting then when we see kind of the collapse of the Tokugawa in 1868 and the transition, one of the first things all of the warlords want to do is tear their castles down. Because these things are huge money sucks, as anyone who has a house knows.
Yeah, so we're getting into like a bunch of different threads that I want to pick up and follow. But one thing that I wanted to ask was something that stumped me when I first started to do translation projects. I had to do a translation about Fukuoka Castle, and there was some unit of measurement that they used to express the size of the castle that I just didn't understand. And I found out much later that castle size, or the scale of the castle, was like expressed in how many bales of rice the castle oversaw in the region. Are you familiar with this at all?
Yeah, so the fundamental unit of kind of wealth for warlords in the Edo period, so in the early modern period, is what's called the koku, and that is this bushel of rice. And the more powerful you are, the more bushels of rice you are worth. And one bushel of rice is supposedly enough to feed one person for 1 year. And so if you are a major warlord who has, 100,000 bushels of rice,
Yeah.
then you are a huge figure.
And I think if I'm remembering correctly, they would say that whoever was the daimyo of that castle had been appointed to a however many bushel castle, appointed to oversee a castle that was worth however many bushels. And I think I remember trying so hard, like, is this how much material was put into the building of the castle? Does this express the area of the castle somehow? And it was actually kind of like the area of their dominion that they were in charge of.
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. And I think what the Tokugawa would allow people to build was probably closely tied to what their kokudaka, or their value of bushels was.
Is that true? Because I can see your face, and it looks like you're trying very hard not to tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about.
No, I think that's I haven't come across that specifically with castle size, but
Yeah.
it makes complete sense because this becomes these are really important units all the way through, and actually in the transition then going from Tokugawa into the Meiji period around the 1870s, when they transfer all the old like daimyo and these old titles into modern kind of international standards, European standards, like baron and duke and all of these things, they use the koku values to make
Right.
someone a baron or a duke or a viscount or whatever else.
Right. Okay. Well, so while we're on the topic of money, then, were people at the time happy that these castles were being built? Because we're talking about what, late 16th century when Japan first got castles. I'm guessing at the time, people were not living in very good conditions. They were like living.
Just like the expression, when Japan first got castles. Like it's something that like somebody just showed up and gave them.
Yeah. Well, they were like, well, we need castles. Well, I mean,
like
maybe
how did Japan get castles?
That's a good. Okay, that's a good
Who
first
gave
question.
Japan castles?
Right. Why does Japan suddenly want castles? And then secondly, who pays for them? And then thirdly, other people who presumably aren't living in castles happy about the fact that they're living in squalor, and all of a sudden, down the road, there's a goddamn castle they're not allowed in.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of dissatisfaction about castles in Japan, as most places, for those reasons you outline. I mean, one thing is, that's important is, I mean, Japan has had castles for hundreds of years by this point, but they're generally like smaller kind of mountain fortification stockades. What we see in the late 16th century.
Oh,
which
this
is a
was
big
like
game
3 or
changer.
4 bales of rice kind of castles.
Yeah,
That's what we're talking
pretty
about, right?
much. Yeah.
Yeah.
The big game changer, though, is these giant keeps, like these things you see that really define all the castles that we see now. If we think of a Japanese castle, we see this giant wooden white structure, which is often like 5 or 6 stories high. I mean, something like Himeji
Yeah.
Castle is a great example
Yeah.
of that. And those are the late 16th century. And
Okay.
there are these ideas that, did castles arrive from Europe with the Jesuits that were in Japan at the time? And that was something that was widely believed in Japan really up until the 19th and the end of the 20th century.
That
There was a lot
Japanese
of debate
castle
around that.
building was influenced by the Jesuits?
Exactly, that European castle building ideals essentially arrived in Japan. That, you've got the moats, you've got the walls, you've got these keeps. These are suddenly a new thing that arrive at the same time that the Europeans do.
But why? But they turn up and they're like, you want a castle? They're like, but what possibly could we need a castle for? Is this the monorail of the 16th century?
Yeah, and it becomes similarly obsolete, I guess. But I think the initial thing is to remember is the late 16th century. I mean, Japan is generally at war. And so, that
Right.
also affects kind of the state that most people are living in. And, a lot of the castles are being built by kind of conscripted labor and such. Those people are probably
Right.
not very happy building these things. And so, new castle designs are coming out of this warfare. It's the first time you get firearms in Japan. So there are a lot of factors coming together there. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that these things were actually brought from Japan or Europe, but
Right. So castles weren't primarily built. Primarily, it's been a while since I've done any kind of professional talking. Primarily, Bobby, help me out.
Primarily.
Primarily. Okay, good. So castles, I'm good at this, aren't I? So castles
just say it's a British
weren't-
pronunciation.
Yeah, that's right. So castles weren't mainly built for the aesthetic or for the dick swinging, but rather there was some kind of military objective. If that's the case, why don't we see more military features in castles Like, I don't know, I'm thinking like medieval drawbridges and stuff.
Well, you do see military features in castles. I mean, they're not necessarily in line what you'd expect from European warfare, but most castles do have moats. Most castles do have kind of like windows built in for attacks. They all have kind of like lookout towers.
Well, I'm guessing
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive.
Right. Because I'm guessing that distinctive slope, you know, like you always see that really beautiful curve on the bottom of Japanese castles by the way. I'm guessing that's to stop people climbing up. I'm guessing that's not just aesthetic.
Yeah.
And that's often tied to earthquake proofing as well, that if you built a sheer vertical wall, like a lot of European castles have, that wouldn't survive an earthquake.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so that's one of the things. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons kind of given for that. But I think that's an important point you make about there's a balance there between kind of the military necessity for certain things, certain aspects of a castle. But then also, it is just to show off. If you can build this giant wooden keep, which, is quite flammable in a lot of ways, that's a way to just show off how powerful you are, actually, especially if you paint it white or some of the early ones were gold and red and all sorts of other things. So if you can show off that way, but then have these big walls outside of it.
I don't know if we got to all of your questions, Ali, but I really liked that fourth one about what did the poor people think of this? It reminded me of that scene in Monty Python where the peasants are talking about the king, and they're like, well, I didn't vote for him. They didn't really have a say in what went on, Ali.
Well, obviously they didn't, but like you can. Okay, the way I often think this when I go and see a really beautiful church in the UK, right? Particularly when you go to a regional one, because like there was a bit of wealth in the cities, but you go to a regional beautiful cathedral in the UK, they're magnificent, right? And you're just thinking this was built 400 years ago, right? Where people were living in utter squalor. But at least the church did do like community outreach. Sometimes it would do education. Sometimes you could go there for food. Like also God was there as well. So like that helped. Like I kind of get that like these enormous, great big like building projects like maybe wouldn't have annoyed people as much. But a castle, like regular people aren't allowed in it. They don't necessarily see the benefit unless they're being invaded. And even if they are being invaded, like they're not seeking refuge in it. Like, was there any kind of like debate as to whether money or resources, let's say, and if resources is a euphemistic term for slave labor, could be put to better use?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to get at a lot of the sources from, especially kind of peasants and the people who are really being exploited in terms of what their views towards castles are, because, I mean, there's a lot of censorship. This would be a very sensitive subject. We do know that a lot of things don't get rebuilt. I mean, like the Great Keep of Edo Castle, for example. I mean, the shogun's own castle burns down in the late 17th century, and they never rebuild it because it's, they think it's too expensive, it's a waste of money. But what is really interesting is if you go to any castle in Japan today, they will tend to have inside like a museum, and you've got some swords and some armor and a bunch of things about like the warlord and kind of the samurai history there. Very few of them actually talk about like the peasant history. And very few of them talk about all the peasant uprisings that took place during the early modern period. I mean, there's hundreds and thousands that take place of peasant uprisings throughout Japan.
A lot of the Japanese history that I read is kind of very concerned with putting down peasant uprisings.
Yeah, but you don't see those. There's only one or two exhibits in like the hundreds of castles in Japan now that actually deal with like peasant uprisings and actually talk about that side of things. The rest of it is much more the, warlords, samurai, weapons, armor. Which, in a lot of ways is similar to the UK. If you go to most castles, they are talking about the aristocracy. It's about knights and aristocrats and this and that. And you don't talk about, the peasants in that Monty Python scene.
It's almost like rich people write the history.
I'll have to give that some more thought. I don't know. You're blowing my mind.
All right. So we've got the first castles. We've got the first big castles in Japan, late 16th century, early 17th century. Right? Why did there become so many? Was Japan worried about outside invasion at this point, or was it worried about keeping territory internally? What's the reason that there's loads of castles?
It's effectively just this kind of internal system that, the Tokugawa shogun is kind of the most powerful of all of these, 250-something warlords around Japan. And they're kind of just maintaining this, and at least on the surface, even though the country is at peace for over 250 years, it's officially organized like a military state. The shogun is the great general, and the others are like kind of lesser generals. And it's obvious, kind of looking at what happens in European developments in terms of warfare, that castles in Japan are obsolete. And so what we do see in the 1860s then is a few attempts to modernize things. They put steel plates on a few castles to see if that would make a difference when you get these threats from the Americans and others. And that's also where you get the building in the 1860s of these star forts, like the Goryokaku in Hakodate up in Hokkaido, if anyone's been to that. It's like this modern European-style star fort, which, you would recognize from the UK or the Netherlands or other places. And so there's a couple of those things built as kind of concessions, but everyone realizes that castles are militarily obsolete. It is just a lot of it is just for show by that point.
It's embarrassing, but I've been watching a lot of sci-fi recently, and it took me a second to realize that a star fort was not a space station. I want to go back to this idea that you were talking about. You first became drawn to this topic when you realized that Japan was kind of covered in these concrete castles. And I don't think I really realized that. I think the farthest that I went with it was when I was placed originally in Saga Prefecture, somebody took me to see Saga Castle. And one of the first questions I asked was, how long has this been there? And they said since the 80s. Since the 1980s. And my curiosity didn't go any further than that. It just kind of shut off. It was like, oh, this isn't a real castle. And I didn't put any further thought into it beyond that. And now that you've mentioned
this is
it,
just
now that
boom era folly. This is just some salary man that's made his money in Tokyo that's thought, well, do you know what? How can I make my mark back in Saga?
But so, Oleg, why was there a castle in Saga that was built out of concrete in the 1980s? And why is this a phenomenon that we see in other places in the country?
Well, I think that's a really good point. I think your reaction is actually the one I had initially. I first moved to Japan around 2000, I think. And, the first time I went to a couple of castles, Nagoya, Okazaki, there were these concrete things. And from the outside, it was like, oh, that's interesting. And I went inside, and it's just kind of institutional, modern concrete building. And it was pretty unexciting. And that's where my mind switched off as well. I did like, kind of visiting them as I traveled around Japan, but I wasn't that interested in them for the longest time. And then I met my friend Ron Zweigenberg in 2013, and he's actually the one that really picked up on a lot of this stuff, because he's written a lot of work on Hiroshima. And when he was investigating the development of the Peace Park in Hiroshima in the 1950s, he discovered in the newspapers that there were all these debates and controversies that as they're trying to create this world peace city in Hiroshima and building the Peace Park, and they've got Tange Kenzo building all the memorial and everything else, just a couple hundred meters to the north, there are these guys rebuilding this castle out of concrete, which is like the symbol of militarism and the pre-war. And they're like, stop it. This is not our brand now. We're about peace. We're about these other things. And there's this huge conflict going on, these tensions in Hiroshima, really from the 50s onward. Yeah. And so Ron picked up on this, and then he and I started kind of talking about this. And we've now been working on this for almost 10 years together.
We should take a second here to give a shout out to Ron, because I met him recently. His son goes to my daughter's preschool, and I ran into them in the supermarket. I ran into his family in the supermarket, and he's Israeli. And his son that's in my daughter's preschool is very distinctive looking. It's like full blonde curly hair, which stands out a lot. So I recognized his kid instantly and started talking to the mom. And the mom was like, oh, yeah, our kids go to the same preschool. And my husband's a big fan of your show. And he came over, and I started talking to him about the show. And I was like, how'd you find out about our show? And he was like, oh, I co-wrote the book with Castles. I co-wrote the book on Castles with Oleg. It's like, that's not a
great.
fan of the show. That's a guest candidate right there.
That's a colleague.
Yeah.
This mad. You should be carrying stickers around with you, Bobby. When these moments happen, we've really got to leverage them.
I think I did give him a sticker, but it was a Bobby's barbecue sticker.
Okay. The question is, which one of you asked for a signature first? For an autograph?
I think so. One of his main fields of study has something to do with Japanese nuclear works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's essentially on. He started doing a lot of work. His first book was on Hiroshima and kind of like the origins of kind of global memory culture, how the atomic bombings should be one of the things that the entire world should remember. Yeah, and putting this in the context of kind of Auschwitz and other things, these kind of global memory events. And
yeah, we talked a little bit about having him on the show potentially, and he was like, my research area might be a little bit dark, and I was like, I think we could do it.
Yeah,
we'd find a way.
Yeah. And I don't think it takes two geniuses to work out how watching genocide happen and potential nuclear war we can somehow tie to to today's news.
Try to shoehorn that in.
I think we've probably managed that. Good. Well, that's nice. Well, isn't that nice to know that we had listeners? I wonder if we still do after this break. Well, thanks for sticking through the episode so far, this longer section. Right, I am going to return back to the Hiroshima castle rebuilding point, because I think that raises a couple of interesting issues. Firstly, forgive me if this is a stupid question, but are all of these castles being rebuilt because they were destroyed by the war?
No, and I mean that's a really important point. There's this kind of idea that, Japan has all these concrete castles because all of the originals were destroyed in the war.
That's what I thought.
Really, Japan has, probably, and if we're talking about castles, I mean, I'm mainly talking about castle keeps at this point, these big white structures in the middle.
Yeah.
Japan has about, probably somewhere between 60 and 100. There's various definitions of these structures, kind of at the time of the Meiji Restoration, like around 1868. And the first thing they want to do, again, these things are expensive, is they just want to tear them down. They're just these embarrassing reminders of the feudal past. This is a time you're moving into civilization and enlightenment. You're bringing in European ideals. You're trying to be westernized. And they just start tearing all these things down. And so you end up with only about 20 of them left at the turn of the 20th century. And then about 7 or 8 are destroyed in the Second World War by bombings. And now we've got about 12 left.
Okay.
So why were they expensive to maintain once they were up?
I mean, they are huge wooden structures. You get storms, you get fires, you get earthquakes. And we just saw Kumamoto, the 2016 earthquake.
Yeah.
All the damage that did. Yeah, all the walls, the keep. And I mean, that was a concrete keep. I don't know how a wooden keep would have fared in that. But,
are they being used for anything? Like council buildings or like storage? Or is there any purpose to them at all?
Well, this is the other side of it. They're mainly just storage, the keeps militarily, then you've got like the daimyo and quite a lot of samurai living in the castle, who are all obsolete. Once you have the new imperial government from 1868, yeah. And so you suddenly have these giant structures in the center of almost every Japanese city, which no longer has a purpose.
Right.
And so you end up tearing down all the old buildings. You build modern schools, modern city halls, administrative buildings. And you also put the military in there because you're now creating a new imperial army to take the place of the former samurai and daimyo. And so most of these castles in major cities like Fukuoka turn into military bases.
I understand why people would want to tear them down then, but presumably there was also some calls to keep them, even if Japan was ashamed of its military past or the fact that these represent a Japan that Japan no longer wants to be. There are going to be the preservists, conservativists who say, well, we should keep hold of them. And I guess
just a quick interjection. I think you mean conservationist and preservationist, because a conservatist sounds like somebody who conserves things, and a preservist sounds like somebody who makes jam.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm not claiming to be on form. Let me be quite clear. Hey, I'm attempting the big words. And sometimes, Oleg, you teach at a university level. Wouldn't you rather that I attempt to use a big word and get it wrong than not?
Oh, that's a tough question. Because then I have to go look up the big word. That's more work for me.
Right. Okay, so we've got people making jams. And we've got the political right, the conservativists. Right. The question I'm trying to ask is, also, there was a semi-important point, which is, aren't there international legal obligations too? Like, at this point, is UNESCO not involved?
No, I mean, we're talking about the 1870s, and at this point, there's very little interest in conservation. And I mean, that's important to note that, in Japan, people are really happy to get rid of these castles. They are seen as this kind of embarrassing reminder of the past that Japan's trying to get away from. It's also an incredibly anti-samurai period. I mean, no one sees the samurai as a model for anything in the 1870s and 1880s. And it's really only when these kind of Japanese delegations start going to Europe a lot more and seeing that, hey, Europe's got all of these castles, and like the Queen lives in Windsor Castle, and actually maybe there's some value to these things, that this starts getting reconsidered. And you have a lot of Europeans and Americans who are in Japan at the time, and they are going to these castles and are obviously valuing them and photographing them. And so that's where you start getting these ideas about conservation and preservation and jam. But the other thing that I'd like to note, though, is that Japan is not an outlier here. I mean, these ideas are very much still developing in Europe at the time. Like, just up the road from me here in Newcastle, they wanted to tear down the Newcastle castle to build a train station on top of it. And they did end up tearing down most of the castle, but they built a train station next to it and kept the keep. But that's something you find all over Europe at this time. So, I mean, Japan, in a lot of ways, is just kind of going with, global trends.
Just before we move on, I'm going to have to ask, why is that why Newcastle's called Newcastle? Because they got a Newcastle? Obviously it is. But do you know any more than that?
No, I mean, that is why it is called Newcastle, but I don't know when new was new in Newcastle's case. I think it's a few hundred years ago.
We brought a castle expert on, Bobby. We did our best.
I'm curious about kind of ideas about historical preservation in Japan, because I've also been kind of surprised by the castle history I'm curious about like the idea of historical preservation in Japan, because I've been surprised by the way they treat castles in their history from both sides. I was surprised to find out that they built a concrete castle in the 80s. Fukuoka Castle, I also did a TV report a while back where they uncovered the outer wall of the original Fukuoka Castle moat. And there's a place where you can go down underneath the sidewalk, and they've got a little staircase set up where you can see this excavated area where they found the old moat wall. And when I was doing the report, they said they found this during subway construction in like the 60s, and they had no record of what it was or that it was there. And I couldn't believe that something like a major castle like Fukuoka Castle, they wouldn't have maps and surveys and records of where the things were. And they were just like, Japan didn't keep those. They got rid of all of it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot was lost. I mean, through just destroyed fires, various other things. So we have lost a lot. I think that's one of the things that's really shifted over the last 100 years, though, is attitudes towards, I think what we're looking for is authenticity. There's preservation, which is kind of keeping old buildings around. Then there's reconstruction, whether out of concrete or out of wood. But I think one thing that's important to note in the case of castles, like with temples or shrines in Japan, is the fact that these things are made of wood, and, you can't really have 1,000-year-old wooden building with all the original timbers.
Yeah.
Those things have to be replaced every few hundred years. And that's the thing, like something like Himeji Castle, which had a huge renovation in the 60s, and there's been another renovation more recently. They go in and they take out all the rotten timbers or things that need to be replaced. They replace them with new ones. But, is that still the original Himeji Castle if all the timbers have been swapped out? I mean, it's kind of like the George Washington's axe thing,
Yeah.
It's only had 4 new heads and 8 new handles since he owned it, but it's still the same axe.
Yeah, of course. And presumably it's not just about replacing the timbers, it's also about making these buildings like earthquake proof based on our current understandings of how we should build buildings to prevent them from falling down, or even something as simple as like wheelchair access.
Yeah. I guess Alex Kerr also talked about this when he was on the show, about just kind of Japanese architecture in general and how sturdy and how strong Japanese wood construction was, but how as soon as it falls out of use or as soon as you stop maintaining it, things start to go to rot. And so if you have these buildings that aren't actively in use and actively being maintained, or it's too costly to actively maintain them anymore, they can quickly go from, a very sturdy structure to ruin.
Which is what happens in the 1870s and why so many of them are torn down, because, people weren't interested in these things. They were obsolete. They were doing the bare minimum. And, 5-10 years of not doing anything, and these things were just ripe for being torn down. Or, there are places where they just want to, Himeji, for example, I think they wanted to burn it down and just take the metal out of the ashes and salvage that, in the 1870s.
So we've got about a dozen castles now that didn't get torn down, and presumably these are now staying up forever. Right, like they're probably not going to go anywhere, not going to be replaced by an Aeon shopping mall or something. Are there people now that got rid of them, or is there is UNESCO involved now?
Yeah, so Himeji Castle is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. All of the original castles are like national treasures. The Japanese government, they've designated that way. There's no push to do anything with the kind of wooden castles, the original ones. The issue's mainly now around the concrete castles, because most of these were built in the 1950s, And as people familiar with American road infrastructure know, concrete, starts to age a bit after about 70 years, and you need to do something.
Right.
And so a lot of these, like Nagoya, Hiroshima, a lot of these have either already been condemned or will be condemned soon. And either you repair the concrete, no one really loves these concrete keeps, and it's either you repair that and spend millions, or you tear it down and rebuild it out of wood, which is what everyone wants, but it's incredibly expensive. And because of those issues, that Ollie just touched on in terms of earthquake proofing, safety, fire safety, accessibility, concrete keep, you can have a wheelchair in that and no one complains. With the wooden ones, there are big debates about accessibility, like something like Nagoya Castle is the place where we have the most debate about that. But one thing I just want to say is one of the reasons, because Ollie mentioned this, one of the reasons they went with concrete, so many of these are built in the 1950s and 1960s, the vast majority. And, the memory of the war is still really fresh.
Yeah.
And so you want something that's going to last. And so
Right.
you build out of concrete.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the main things behind it.
That's also funny because it's on brand for Saga. If most of the castle reconstruction was done in the 50s and 60s, Saga is famous for getting all of the trends 20 years late. It makes sense why they built theirs in the 80s. So if we want to kind of abandon these historically inaccurate concrete castles that were already controversial, then let's avoid controversy and build accurate wooden castles. Problem solved?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the thing. I mean, so one of the things here is so many of the concrete castles are actually, they call them reconstructions, but they never actually existed. Like, there was never a keep there. I mean, Karatsu, just down the road from you, is an example of that. They just decide, everyone else has a castle keep, so we need one as well.
Right.
And so a lot of places in the 50s and 60s just built these fantasies. Even something like Hiroshima, which did have a castle keep and knew exactly what it looked like, it was blown over by the A-bomb. When they rebuilt it out of concrete, they're like, well, we're doing it out of concrete anyway, so we can make it a bit bigger and we can give it these fancier bits and make it look cooler than it did before.
Right.
Whereas now the real debate, in especially like Nagoya, which is one of very few places where we do have all of these architectural drawings and we could really do it authentically, so to speak, for various probably obvious reasons, pre-modern castles were not the most accessible. And so if you're using public money to rebuild a site, should that be accessible for everyone? Should you be able to get wheelchairs and other access into these?
So, as we discussed in the beginning of the show, these castles are originally built as military fortifications. If you're going to look at that and say, hey, it's not accessible, my response is, yes, because it's a good castle.
Exactly. Yeah. If we're going by the original plans, only enter if you're part of the military.
Only enter if you're a part of the military on the right side.
Yeah, exactly. This would be a very easy justification to not allow foreign tourists in. You guys were the reason that we built this in the first place.